Yeah, hello everyone. Let's wait for 2 more minutes to join others, then we'll start. Okay. Hello everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the IBM Internship Program by Programmers.io. I am Yasant Kag and I have around 4 years of experience in IBM and the relative technologies. And today we will learn about SQLRPGLE and cursors in IBM. So in this presentation, we will see about overview of SQL RPGLE. Then we'll see some of the example statements related to SQL within the RPGLE. Then we'll see cursors in SQL RPGLE and type of SQL cursors. And then we'll see the example of fetch the multiple rows in SQL RPGLE, how we can fetch the multiple rows within one SQL statement. Then we'll see about dynamic SQL, how we can prepare the dynamic SQL within SQL RPGLE program. And then we'll see some of the Sqlcode and Sqlstate. What are the use of Sqlcode and Sqlstate and how to implement them into the program. At the end, we will see about benefits of using SQLRPGLE. Then we'll see if you have any questions, we can answer in that QA session. So let's start with the first point, overview of SQLRPGLE. So SQLRPGLE is a program in which we can use SQL within the RPGLE. So it's a combination of SQL within the RPGLE programs. So SQLRPGLE is a powerful tool that combines the functionality of SQL with RPGLE. And that approach allows developers to interact with DB2 for I database using the embedded SQL statements within the RPGLE programs. So we can use the SQL statements within the RPGLE programs to work on the tables in the DB2. Next, we have SQL statements in RPGLE. So here are the free format and fixed format syntax for the SQL statements within the RPGLE program. So you can see in the fixed format, we can start the SQL with /exec SQL just after the C spec. And in the next line, we can give plus icon just after the C spec to start our SQL query. And then we can put our SQL query which we want to execute in the program. And at the end, we can give slash and exec to end the SQL statement. In the free format, we can start with the exec SQL. Then we can give our SQL query and we can give semicolon to end the SQL statement. Let me jump into the green screen to show you exactly how it's working in the program. So this is the first fixed format program in which we have SQL within the RPGLE. So this is SQL RPGLE program. So you can see over here the same syntax is written here. We start with the slash exec SQL, then we have C plus, then our SQL query which we want to execute. Then at the end we have slash and exec. So this SQL query will be executed when this statement will be executed, and it will do the operations within the whatever in the SQL query. Let me quickly do the debug so I can show you how it's working. So on the first main line, we have assigned a variable employee ID with 101. This variable will be used within the SQL RPGLE. Here you can see it is a select statement selecting a particular column employee name from table EMPPF1 where employee ID equals to a variable, and this variable has value 101. So it will fetch the employee ID equals to 101. So I can show you the value over here. So it is 101. So here this variable is a host variable, as this is a program variable and we are using in the SQL. So it called as host variable. And the fetch statement will fetch the employee name from this table for that particular employee ID and store it in this program variable WEMP name. So if I press F10 over here to execute this SQL, we can see what value inside this variable. So the value is Har Sharma, which is the name of employee ID for employee ID 101. Let me show you in another session how the records are there in the file. So this is strSQL, and here I have that select query on EMPPF1, the same table. For employee ID 101, we have name Harsh Sharma. So the same name it fetch here within the program. Then we have display command to display this at end of the program. So this was a simple syntax for the fixed format SQL RPGLE program to how you can use the SQL within the fixed format RPGLE. And there is another example for free format as well. In this is the same SQL query which was in presentation, which I showed you earlier. And it is started with that exec SQL. Then we have the select query, the SQL query which you want to execute. And at the end, we have this semicolon to end the SQL statement. So employee ID 102, it will fetch the employee ID 102 record and for a particular column employee name and store it in the variable. Then we have another example of employee department equals to RPG. So on the first example, we have employee ID 102. So we have only one particular record for that employee ID. So select statement will fetch only one record at a time. That should be unique record. So if I can show you on that table, you can see for employee ID 102, we have a particular one record over here, not multiple. But if we can see about employee department, there are two records for employee department RPG. So how we can fetch those records over here in the program? So here, this is the example of another free format. Here we have employee department equals to RPG and it will fetch the employee name. But which record it will fetch? Either this one or this one. So here SQL will be having an error because the record is not specific. And we have over here get diagnostic to see what error occurred on this SQL. Get diagnostic is a method in the SQL to see the information related to the SQL executed just before this. So the recent SQL execution, we can see the information, whatever the information we want to see, that we can see with get diagnostic. Then here we have another method, the same SQL for RPG. And here we have one more statement. So this is for the, now we have two records for employee department RPG, but we want to see at least one record at a time. We know that select statement can't fetch multiple records at a time, but at least it should show at least one record. So for that, we can give fetch first row only, this statement just after our SQL statement. At the end of SQL statement, we can give fetch first row only. So it will fetch the first row only if we have the multiple records for that SQL. So for employee department RPG, we have two records, 101 employee ID and employee ID 103. So when we will use fetch first row only, it will fetch the first row only, employee ID 101 only. Okay, so here how it will be working fine, because now we have only one record. Then we have another example to fetch all the columns from a table for a particular employee ID. If we are going for a particular employee ID, all the records in the table we have unique with employee ID. So for each employee ID, we have only one record. And here we are selecting star. Star means all the columns, and it will store into this EMPDS. And this DS is based on EMP-PF1. It will have all the columns which we have inside the PF. So let me show you the declaration how I have declared that EMPDS, this one. So DS name is EMPDS and we have put ext name, external name for that PF EMP-PF1, and that is a qualified DS. So it will have all the columns for that whatever inside in this PF EMP-PF1. Let me go to the SQL again. So it will select all the columns and store it into this DS, EMPDS, which has all the columns. Then we have another example of multiple columns, not all the columns, just a multiple columns. So we have two columns, employee name and employee department, and we are storing into a DS for a particular employee ID. This EMPDS1 has two subfields, employee name and employee department only. Let me show you the DS declaration. So this is the DS, and it has first subfield employee name and the second subfield employee department. and we are selecting employee name, comma employee department from that table. So it will store into this DS. And here now we have two examples over here. In first one, we can fetch all the columns from a table and store it into a DS. In the another one, we can fetch multiple columns, not all, into a DS. So it requires, or it is based on the program requirement, whatever the requirement we have. If we need all the columns inside the program, we can use this statement. If we need only selected columns, then we can use this statement. If we don't need all the columns, then we generally avoid to use this star, because it will fetch all the columns. So performance wise, it will be poor than this. Okay. So until or unless we are not required for all the columns in the program, um, this is recommended to use this statement to fetch the selected columns. Let me show you in debug how it's working. So in the first SQL statement, it will fetch the employee ID 102 record for that column employee name and store it in this variable W employee name. So I can show you the value over here, which is this value, Arun Prakash. And inside the table for employee ID 102, we have the same name. Okay, we'll display the name. Then we have the next statement to fetch the record for employee department RPG. But we have multiple records for that employee department RPG. So it should throw an error because a select statement um, can't fetch the multiple records. It can fetch only one record at a time. Okay, so SQL is executed, and if I show you the SQL code over here, which is negative. So SQL code negative means it has some error. We will see about SQL code and SQL state in upcoming slides. But for now, you can keep in mind that if SQL code is negative, that means there is some error in the SQL. And this is the cat diagnostic SQL statement, which in that we will see what is the error occurred on this SQL, the recent SQL execution. So this W message will be populated with that message. It has result of select more than one row. So for the employee department RPG, we have two records. That's the error. That's why we have this message result of select more than one row. Then we have another SQL to fetch the first row for employee department RPG. So it will fetch at least one row for employee department RPG. And here, if I show you the employee name, it is Harsh Sharma. So for employee department RPG, we have two records over here. First one is this employee ID 101. Another one is employee ID 103. The first fetch will work on this employee ID 101. So it will show the value Harsh Sharma at like this. It will display the name. Then we have the next statement to fetch all the columns for that particular employee ID. And it will store inside that DS. Let me show you the value of DS. So for employee ID 102, we have employee ID 102, employee name, employee department, age, phone number, and email. All the values we have within one SQL. The same values are over here inside the table for employee ID 102. Then here we have the next SQL. It will fetch multiple columns from a table for that one particular employee ID, and it will store it into a DS. Let me show you what values inside this DS. So we have employee name and employee department for employee ID 102. This is how it's working in fixed format and free format, how we can use SQL statements within the fixed format and free format. Let me jump into the PPT again. Moving to the next slide. Cursors in SQLRPGLE. So a cursor is a temporary result set area created in the system memory when an embedded SQL statement is executed. So it stores the multiple rows within the cursors. Now, in the previous example, we saw that a select statement can only fetch one record at a time. So how we can fetch multiple rows? That's why cursor comes to the picture. Cursor can hold multiple records within it, and that will be temporary result set, and we can fetch one by one row from the cursor and use it in our program. So a cursor provides a way to access a result table. It can access a complete table as well, that we can say a result set. And SQL uses a cursor to work with the rows in the result table and to make them available to the program. So it stores all the records what are executed in the SQL statement so that we can use each one of the record within the program. And a program can have multiple cursors, but each should have a unique name of cursor. Next, we have type of SQL cursors. The first one is serial cursors. So a serial cursors in SQL RPG are a special type of cursor that allows you to process result sets sequentially. So it can fetch the records from a cursor which is executed within the SQL statement, and it can fetch one by one row. So first it will fetch the first row from the cursor. Then if we will again fetch the next record, then it will fetch the second row. Then it will fetch the third row. Like this, it will fetch sequentially. Serial cursors can only move forward through the result set. It can't move backward. It can't jump within the cursor. Serial cursors are particularly useful when processing large volume of data when you need to read row one by one in a serial fashion. So if you want to read the multiple records in a sequential manner, then we can use the serial cursor. Let me show you the example how we can use serial cursor in SQLRPGLE. This is the example of using serial cursor in SQLRPGLE. Here we have a declare statement. Just after this declare statement, we have same select statement. This select statement can have multiple records. And this declare statement will declare the cursor for the multiple records or whatever record we have in the below SQL. So it has the syntax declare, then the cursor name and cursor for this SQL. So it will declare a cursor for multiple rows. Then we have to open the cursor so we can use the records within the program and we can fetch the records. It will be available to the program. So after opening the cursor, we can fetch the records from cursor. So here we are opening the cursor. Then we are fetching the cursor with the fetch statement and storing it into some variables within the loop. So we can read multiple records over here. After using the cursor, if our work is done with the cursor, we can close the cursor. Here we are closing the cursor. After closing the cursor, we can't fetch the record from cursor. To fetch again, we will need to open the cursor again. And then we have another cursor over here, and it has name EMP-CSR1. Earlier we were having EMP-CSR. So each cursor, if we have multiple cursors within the program, each cursor should have unique name. And it works on, it is selecting the employee ID, employee name from table EMPPF1, where department equals to RPG. So for department RPG, we have two records, employee ID 101, employee ID 103. So it will hold these two records inside the cursor. Then we can open the cursor, and then we can use fetch statement to fetch rows one by one within the cursor. At the end of this, we can close the cursor as we are done with the working with this cursor. Let me show you in debug how it's working. So here it will select all the rows as we have select employee ID, employee name, employee department from table EMPPF1. We don't have any where clause, so it means it will fetch all the records. So we have all three records over here. And after opening the cursor, it will be available for the fetch statement to fetch the records row by row. So after first fetch statement, it will fetch the first row. Let me show you what value inside this employee ID variable. We have 101, which is the first row. And same name for that employee ID 101 and the department. In the next fetch statement, it will fetch the next row within the cursor, which is employee ID 102. So now we have employee ID 102 and the same name for that employee ID and the department of employee ID 102. So like this, it will fetch all the records. Now this is the third record. Now we are done with all the records has been fetched already. Now it will give some error or warning. So SQL code 100 means it all the records has been completed or it reached to the end of the records within the cursor. So if I can show you the value inside the SQL code, it is 100. SQL code 100 means it reached to the end of the record. So it will leave out of come out from the loop. Then you can close the cursor. And here there is another cursor which has employee department RPG. And for employee department RPG, we have two records, employee ID 101, employee ID 103. So it will fetch these two records. So the first one I can show you is employee ID 101. And the second one is employee ID 103. After this, it will come out from the loop as all records are completed for employee department RPG. And you can close the cursor. This is how we can use serial cursors in um, SQLRPGLE program. Let me again show you the program. So this fetch statement works like read statement or read opcode in RPGLE programs. So alternatively, we can use high level opcodes and file level built-in functions to handle to fetch the records from a file and to handle some errors. Here we are using SQL statements. So this fetch statement will work like um, a read opcode. It will read the record row by row. Here we don't have any where clause, so it means no key are there. Alternatively, we use keys inside our physical file while using the file level opcodes. Then we have in the next example, we have employee department RPG. So instead of using SQL, if we use that old method, high level opcodes, we can give select inside our PF or LF, and we can give the RPG value so it can fetch. So instead of using keys inside the physical files, we can directly use where clause. So this is very useful when using SQL statements. No need to create multiple LFs. Only one PF we can perform multiple filter operations. Now let me show you one error inside this. What if I come out from the loop before closing the cursor? So let me debug this program again. First, it will declare the cursor, then it will open the cursor, it will fetch the first row. Now let's suppose our program abnormally ended over here. And if I come out from here, if I press F3 and if I call this again, then you can see after opening the cursor, it did not go to the loop because our SQL code is not 0. Our SQL code is -502. That means it is negative. It means there is some error. And what error here is, we can use get diagnostic to see what message corresponding to that SQL code. Alternatively, we can go to the job log and we can see what error. Let me quickly go to the display job log and F10, shift F6 to go to the bottom. And we can see the error over here. It says cursor EMP CSR already open or allocated. That is because of when we call this program first time, after the first fetch statement, I press F3 to come out from the program. So it abnormally ended. And the cursor was not ended at that time. When I call this second time, the cursor was already opened. And now it is trying to open it again. That means there is some error. Because when we are using open cursor statement, it should be closed before this. So how we can handle this? Our program can abnormally ended in between the loop as well. If we have some error, if we have any runtime error, it can. This can be a possibility. So how we can handle this? To handle this, I have another example. Let me show you. We can set the options for the SQL which we use inside the program with set option SQL command. So we can use exec SQL set option to set the options for the SQLs which will be executed within this program. And this is the parameter or option we can give over here. Close SQL cursor equals to star end mode. So if our program abnormally ended just after the fetch statement before closing the cursor, it will automatically close the cursor. Let me show you this program in debug, how it's working. First, it will declare the cursor, then it will open the cursor. After first fetch statement, if I press F3 to come out from this without closing the cursor, and now if I calling again, let me do and debug this again. Now it is again trying to open the cursor, but earlier I press F3 or come out from the program before closing the cursor. But this time we have set option close SQL cursor equals to star mode over here. So it should close the cursor if program abnormally ended. So we can see it's working fine now. It is going to the loop. We have SQL code 0 over here after opening the cursor. There is no error. So it is reading all the record. So this is recommended. If we are using cursors within the SQLRPGLE program, we can use this set option for that SQL. So it will apply to all SQLs which we use inside this program. And this option will not throw error if the program ended up normally without closing the cursor. Let me jump into the PPT again. Next, we have scrollable cursor. So a scrollable cursor in SQL RPG allows you to navigate through a result set in multiple directions. It can be either forward, backward, or even move to a specific row. So previously we saw serial cursor. Serial cursor can move only forward direction, but scrollable cursor can move backward as well. Even it can jump to any specific row. And scrollable cursors are useful for applications that need to display data in a paginated format or provide complex navigation features. So it depends on the program requirement, whatever we have, whatever is needed inside our program. Based on that, we can use scrollable cursor as well. If you want to move backward within the cursor, if you want to jump within the cursor, then we can use scrollable cursor. Let me jump into the program how to show you how it's working. So this is the example of scrollable cursor. Just a small difference is here with serial cursor that we can use scroll just before this cursor. So after declare, we can give our cursor name. After that, we can give scroll cursor or whatever SQL statement we want to store inside the cursor. Then the next we have same, we can open the cursor to be available for the fetch statement to fetch the records from the cursor. Then we have fetch the first row. To fetch the first row, we can use this statement, fetch first from emp csr. So first is a keyword over here to fetch the first row from this cursor into these variables. Then we have the next statement to fetch the next row. Here we can use next keyword just after the fetch to fetch the next record from the cursor. Then we have how we can fetch the previous row. So to fetch the previous row, we can use prior keyword just after the fetch statement. So it will fetch the previous row. Then we have row relative. So it can row relative. It will fetch the row relative to the current position by whatever number of rows we want to forward. So the syntax is like this: fetch, then relative. This is a keyword. And here we can give how much rows we want to move forward. So this can be a variable name as well, a host variable it can be, and it can be hard coded as well. This should be a decimal. Either it can be joined, pegged, or integer, but it should be decimal. And it will fetch the row relative to the current position and store it into these variables. Let me show you in debug how it's working. So on the main line, we have scroll cursor declare statement. Then we are opening the cursor, and in the next line, it will fetch the first row. So the first row, we have employee ID 101. So after this, after execution of this fetch statement, we can see we have employee ID 101 and the same name for that employee ID and the same department. Then it will fetch the next row with the next fetch next statement. So we can see employee ID is 102. And we in the table also we have the next record employee ID 102 and the same name and department for that employee ID. Then we have the fetch prior statement. It will fetch the previous record. Now we are on record number employee ID 102. From this, if it will read the prior record, it will be employee ID 101. So now we can see employee ID is 101 over here. Then we have, now we are on employee ID 101. From there, we want to fetch the relative to. Relative to means now we are on employee ID 101. From here, it will jump to the 2 row and then read the next statement. So from employee ID 101, if it will read the relative to record, it will be 103. And after executing this SQL statement, we can see the employee ID is 103, same name for that employee ID, same department. Once we are done with the working for that cursor, and we can close the cursor. So this is how we can use scrollable cursors within the SQLRPGLE programs. These are very useful, and these are, if I can show you the source again, on the first, this fetch first statement is similar to the file level opcode read, where we can use setlr and then read opcode to read the first row. Then if we use again read, it will fetch the next row. So next is also similar to the read statement. Then we have prior, which is similar to the read p in the file level opcode. We use read p to read the previous record. Here we can use fetch prior. And relative to, it will jump to the relative rows from the current cursor position. Okay, I'm moving to the PPT again. Next, we have fetch multiple rows in SQLRPGLE. So in the previous example, we saw for the serial cursors and scrollable cursors, using one fetch statement, we can fetch a particular record or one by one record within the program. But how we can fetch the multiple rows with a single fetch statement? So this is how, this is the example of how we can fetch the multiple rows within with using one fetch statement. We can declare a simple cursor over here. This is a simple example of serial cursor. Then we can open the cursor. Then we can use a fetch statement, fetch employee cursor. This is the cursor name 4, and this is the syntax. We can use 4. Just after this, we can give how much rows we want to fetch at a time within one fetch statement. How much rows? Then we can give rows. Let's suppose we have value for this variable is 10. So it will be 10 rows. So it will read 10 rows at a time from the cursor and store it into a DS. So it will fetch the multiple records, and if we are storing it into a DS, then the DS should be array DS, because a simple DS can't store multiple records. If we have array DS, then it can store multiple records. Then this is the same close cursor. Let me show you into the program how we can use this. So this is the example for that. On the first, on the top, we have some declaration. One is employee DS. I have declared employee DS with external name EMPPF1. So which will have all the columns which is inside that PF. It will store into this DS. So this DS will have all the subfields of all the columns of this PF. This is a qualified DS having dimension 10. It can store maximum 10 records into this. Then we have a standalone variable number of rows, and it is joint 5 decimal and initialized with the element of EMPDS. So the element of EMPDS, you can see 10 over here. So it will be initialized with 10. The number of rows when the program will start, this variable will have value 10. Then we have one more variable row fetched, joint 5 initialized. And now here we have simple example of serial cursor. It will select all the columns from table EMPPF1, and then we can open the cursor. And after opening the cursor, we can fetch records from the cursor. And here it is fetch cursor name EMPCSR for number of rows. It will have value 10 in decimal. So it will fetch 10 rows into array DS EMPDS. So this fetch statement will fetch 10 records at a time, and it will store it into this EMPDS. And if everything goes fine, SQL executed successfully, then we will have SQL code 0. And again we have this get diagnostic. So as I mentioned, get diagnostic is used to see the information related to the SQL executed just before this. So the recent SQL execution information we can see with the get diagnostic. Here we have another keyword, row count. Using row count, we can see how much rows fetched just before this using the fetch statement. So this how much rows it will fetch, that will store it into the this variable. Let me show you in debug how it's working. First we are declaring the cursor, then we are opening the cursor, then we are executing the fetch statement to fetch the 10 rows at a time. So let me show you the value inside the number of rows is 10. So it will fetch 10, it fetched 10 rows. And if I show you the EMPDS, it is a array DS. So on the first index, we have the first record. Then on the second index, we have the second record. Then on the third index, we have the third record. So overall, we have 3 records into the table, and it fetched all 3 records. But it can fetch maximum 10 records. For now, we have only 3. SQL code is 0 because SQL executed successfully, and using row fetched get diagnostic row count keyword, we can see how much rows fetched. So if I show you the value inside this, it is 3. It means it fetched 3 rows before this using the fetch statement. And then we are closing the cursor. This is the end of program. So this fetch statement is very useful if we want to fetch multiple rows at a time, or if you know the limitation of records we want to fetch at a time. And if you know about subfile or load all subfile, we can use in loader subfile as well to load the 9999 records at a time. So we can use array.ds to load the subfile without using fetch statements multiple times. That will increase the performance. Next, we have dynamic SQL. Dynamic SQL in SQLRPGLE allows you to construct SQL statements dynamically at runtime. So now let's suppose we don't know whatever the SQL statement we want to execute at runtime. It depends on some values. It depends on um, some input or some dynamic things. Or maybe it depends on whatever values will come at that time in that program. So this is useful when you need to execute SQL statements that are not known until runtime. Before calling the program on a particular statement, we don't know which SQL we want to execute. And in that case, we can use dynamic SQL. So SQL command depends on user input or other dynamic conditions. Then we can use dynamic SQL. Let me show you on debug, or let me show you on the green screen how the program is. This is the example of using dynamic SQL. Here on the first line, we have one variable SQL statement. It is character 500. In that, we can construct our SQL statement in a string format. So here we are preparing the SQL statement, which is insert into table name empf1 for these 3 columns: employee ID, employee name, employee department, and the values. So this will be a string until it's not executed. This will be a string, and we are storing a string which is actually a SQL into a variable. And here we have 3 question mark because at this time we don't know what value we want to insert. So we can give question mark, And while executing this SQL, we can give the values for each. After preparing the SQL statement in string format within a variable, we can prepare the statement using prepare statement in SQL. So it will prepare. We can give one unique name. Here it has insert stmt. Any name we can give. So it will prepare a statement with name insert stmt by using this SQL statement. So this is the syntax for prepare statement. Prepare then the statement name from whatever the values for SQL string. Then here three variables are assigned: employee ID, employee name, employee department. Those we want to use while insertion. And then we can use execute command. So after execute, we can use the same statement name which we used in prepare. So in prepare, we use this. Now here it is prepared, and on the execute line, now we are executing that statement using these three variables. So when we are using keyword, it will use those three variable values and assign to those question mark sequence in a sequential manner. So employee ID value of variable employee ID will go to the first question mark. Value of employee name will go to the second question mark, and employee department will go to the third question mark. So sequentially, it will assign those values to question marks and will execute that SQL. So what it will do, it will insert into table with some columns, and values will be whatever we have inside these variables. So the use of this is we can while preparing the SQL, we don't know which values we want to insert. So while executing the SQL, with execute SQL, we can give the values which we want to use in that SQL to execute the SQL. Then again, in the next, we have new values, employee ID 202, name and department. Now here we are not using, again, we are not preparing the SQL. We want to use the same SQL. So let me do page up again. So we want to use the same SQL statement. So this time, this is not required to prepare the SQL again. So, and also we are not preparing the string, SQL string. Also, we are not using the prepare statement. We are directly using the execute command. So it will execute with that same prepare statement with new values. So now this time it will insert these values. So if we are using question mark within the SQL and we are using prepare and execute, then we can only use execute to execute multiple SQL statements with multiple values. Below we have another example. If you avoid using question mark, or if you avoid using prepare and then execute, you know, there are two steps. We have prepare then execute. If you want to execute within one statement, so then we have execute immediate. With using execute immediate, we can execute the SQL immediately without preparing the SQL. So here we are preparing the SQL statement in string format by giving the values inside the string directly. So those values of variables, those variable values will directly assign to this statement, and it will have a complete SQL statement which can be executable directly. So we can execute the statement directly without preparing the statement with using execute immediate SQL. Let me show you in debug how it's working. So on the first main line, we have this insert statement. So you can see this is a simple string in which we have insert into this table, then the columns and values and the question mark. So for now, we don't know which values you want to insert. Then we are preparing the SQL with prepare statement. Then here we are assigning the values to some variables and then using execute command using those three variables. So it will fill those values to the question mark and execute the SQL. Let me show you in the table. We have employee ID 101, 102, 103, but we don't have employee ID 10201. After execute after executed this SQL, we can see into the table that employee ID 201 is inserted. Then again, we are assigning some other values to those variables and executing the statement again. So now it insert one more row for employee ID 202. Then we are assigning the values again. And this is another example of executing directly without preparing the SQL statement. So here we are preparing the full SQL statement within a variable. So this SQL statement variable has insert into table name emppf1. Then we have column names, values, then employee ID and name and the department. So everything inside this. If I copy this SQL and paste in strsql and execute this, it will be executed. That's why it can be execute immediate. So after executing this with execute immediate, you can see we have employee ID 203 over here. So this is how we can use dynamic SQL within the SQLRPGLE program with prepare and execute statement, or we can use execute immediate as per the program requirement. Okay, I'm moving to the next slide, which is SQL code and SQL state. So SQL code and SQL state are very useful when we are using SQLRPGLE. We can handle the errors. We can see if the SQL is executed successfully, or if there is some error or something we can handle using the SQL code and SQL state. On the file level, of course, we can use, you may know, we can use some other things like percent end of file, percent found, some specific built-in functions we can use. But here in SQL, there are a lot of SQL code, a lot of SQL state we can use to handle a lot of type of specific errors. So here are some example of SQL code and SQL state. If SQL code is 0, that means SQL is executed successfully. If SQL code greater than 0 and it's not equals to 100, that means SQL executed successfully, but with a warning. SQL code less than 0 means it was not executed successfully. There is some error. SQL code 100 means there is no row found. SQL executed successfully, but there is no row found. Or we can say there is end of data, reach to the end of data. And SQL code -204 means table or view not found. Then we have some of the SQL states. SQL state is a 5-character variable. If the value is 5 times 0, it means it is successful. If 0 to 1000, it means no data found. If 4 to 601, that means syntax error. So these are some of the SQL code and some of the SQL state which are mainly used. But we can go through the IBM website for a lot of SQL code, a lot of SQL state, any SQL code, any SQL state, we can see what message for that SQL particular SQL code or SQL state, and you can see what error occurred on or what happens to the program after executing the SQL. Moving to the next slide, which is benefits of using SQLRPGLE. There are a lot of benefits when we are using SQLRPGLE. So alternatively, when we were using that high level opcodes, setll, setgt, chan, read, instead of using those opcodes, we can directly use SQL to optimize our program to make more maintainable, to make the more performance wise, it will be enhanced. And by reading the SQL, we can easily see that which values or which records it will fetch. So it improved the readability, it improved the maintainability, it has flexibility, it has SQL power to modify any time to fetch in a different direction. It has a lot of methods, a lot of SQL code, a lot of SQL states to handle the errors. So we can handle any error, or we can see if the SQL was executed successfully or not. And also the portability. So most of the technologies use SQL. Um, if we are using SQL in our program, we can easily see how it's working on the database, and we can easily see the which records or what operations it is performing on the tables. So we can easily integrate to the another technology as well. So it has more portability. Apart from this, we have a lot of more things in SQL. This is only related to SQLRPGLE, but if we are using SQL in DB2, we have a lot of things. We can directly call the API from IBMI using the SQL. We can see any information within the IBMI using the SQL catalog tables and a lot of more things. So this is all for SQLRPGLE and cursors in IBMI. If you have any questions, yeah, please raise.
Uh, so yeah, hi everyone. So from the participants, if anyone have question or queries, so you can put in the Q&A box so that Yashwant can answer all of the queries. Yashwant, there is one question.
Mhm.
Like they're asking about like what happen if I do fetch cursor next for but not exist the next record. You can read also.
Yeah, it will give SQL code 100. If the next record is not present after executing the fetch statement, it will give the SQL code 100. So we can handle it with SQL code 100 directly.
Okay, there is one question also. Like they're asking about like between preparing your SQL statement and executive immediately, which one is best to use and why?
It depends on the program requirement. Um, as I mentioned, as I showed you the program using prepare and execute. There is only we can only we can assign the SQL string within a variable at one time, and we can prepare the at one time, but we can execute it multiple times with multiple kind of values. If that is the requirement, then we can use prepare and then execute we can use multiple times without preparing it again. But if we know the SQL that we want to execute directly, or we can if we can prepare the SQL in string format and that we want to execute, one time with those values only, then yeah, definitely execute immediate is useful. So it depends on the program, or it depends upon the requirement, what requirement we have. Both are useful.
Okay, I think they all get these answers. We will wait 2 more minutes if anyone have queries, so you all can put in the Q&A box. After 2 minutes, we can wrap up this session. Okay, I think there were no more questions, so we can wrap up this session. Thanks, Yashwant. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,